Labour have urged the government to avoid another fiasco, as they put it, and extend the evictions ban. The background to this is as part of the whole complex package of measures that the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, introduced with furloughing workers and giving small loans to businesses and what have you. There was a suspension of the right of landlords to evict people who, simply because of COVID-19, could not find the money to pay their rent. That is due to run out shortly, and Labour are saying that they want the government to extend it, and they've written to the Housing Secretary, Robert Jenrick, saying as much. Labour has introduced changes to our broking housing system that will protect tenants, and we want them to last. I'm delighted to say that Labour's Shadow Housing Minister, Thangam Debbonaire, is on the line now. Thangam, how big a problem is this? How many folk are we actually talking about, in your estimation?
Well, Shelter, who are the homelessness experts, have said that this is about 250,000 people who are at risk starting next week. That's a lot of people. And the reason for this is fairly straightforward. This isn't because people are feckless or not trying to do the right thing. This is people who have, through no fault of their own, due to the coronavirus crisis, lost their income, have suffered a catastrophic loss of income, and maybe not realised that the benefit system was not going to be able to cover all of their housing costs, because at the moment, average rents are not covered. So you could have quite a modest one-bedroom flat, and in lots of parts of the country, it will be £300, £400, £500 above that bit of your benefits and your social security that would cover it. So people have been building up arrears.
Okay, and have you worked out, or Shadow Chancellor Annalise Dodds have worked out, I mean, when you write to Jenrick and say this must happen, P.S. it's going to cost you X, do you know what that number is?
Well, the government's made that quite difficult, actually, because despite me repeatedly asking them to do calculations, they have the means to do that, we don't, to do calculations of how many people accurately are affected. We can only do guesstimates, and we can only do those guesstimates based on limited data. Shelter can only go on what people are telling them. The government has taken no responsibility for assessing the scale of the problem. We've been suggesting for months that there was going to be a problem. They've had no excuse. They were told, even by my predecessor in March, John Healey warned them that there was going to be a crisis if they didn't take steps to make sure that at least average rents were covered by social security, and that the government honoured their own promise that nobody should lose their home due to coronavirus, and brought in place legislation that they themselves say they're going to bring in, which is reforming the laws on evictions. They've said they're going to do this. We're saying to them, bring it now. Bring it now, so that we can make sure courts at least have discretion, can exercise judgment in these cases, which they can't.
I know you to be an honourable woman, and we've chatted in the past. And I said on the programme yesterday, funnily enough, when I was talking to Shelter about this story, but I just couldn't remember the number. That's why I asked you. Yeah. I did point out that the Tories have got a reasonable track record on this. I mean, people like Bob Blackman arguing that local authorities should have a responsibility, and people like James Brokenshire, when he was running that department, seeking to do the right thing. Is it a defence for them, Thangam, simply to say, look, we're doing our best, but we've got rather a lot on the cooker at the moment?
Well, I would ask that, would the government really like to have a crisis in evictions and homelessness just as we go into autumn, when children are going back to school, when the spike in infections and COVID is due to come back to us, when we might have a spike in infections of flu? It's everybody's problem. It's a public health problem when more people are made homeless. But also, Bob Blackman, who I also know to be an honourable man, brought in some good legislation on preventing homelessness. Unfortunately, saying that the local authorities should pick up this cause is just not good enough. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has said this morning that the local government are billions of pounds short of what they actually need, and in my view were promised by this government. They are trying to pick up the slack, but again, I asked the government months ago, what provision were they making to make sure that there were specialist advisors in local councils and in housing organisations, and they have no answer to that, and they still don't appear to. Local councils keep being expected to pick up the tab for things without any acknowledgement, it seems to me, of what it's costing.
Your party is in power in Wales, and they are doing it, I read, at the cost of £8 million. Do you know how many households and individuals are affected in Wales? And can you not simply divide 8 million by that number to give a rough idea of what it would be in England?
Not at the moment, but I think what the government should do, and after all, they are the government, they should be looking at all of these different approaches. Wales offers one model, Shelter, Citizens Advice, Generation Rent, all these different organisations have offered other ideas of things that could be done. I think what's also noticeable, what the Welsh government have done, is that they've made provisions so that people who need to be evicted for really egregious reasons, like, for instance, I've got people on my caseload who are living next door to an absolute neighbour from hell, who are perhaps exploiting young people through county lines or doing other dreadful things. The council and local housing associations need to have the provision to be able to evict people like them, and the Welsh government's made that provision. And all I'm saying is the government should look at all of those different options rapidly. They should have been doing this before now, though. We're on last chance of last chance saloon again.
Yeah.
When I put in the urgent question in July, they had warning then. I asked them in May. I asked them in June. My predecessor asked them in March. They've had plenty of opportunities to do the right thing. They need to speed this up. They may have plenty on, for sure, but that's the business of being in government. That's what
ironically, those words ringing in my ear, Thangam, because Robert Halfon, chair of the Education Select Committee, other side of the house from you, was saying, I warned Gavin Williamson at the department back in July that this was going to be a thing. Now, go on.
The Housing Select Committee did something similar.
Yeah.
So, as with Robert Halfon, so too with Clive Betts and his committee, cross-party select committees, very reputable, honourable members who've warned the government of this crisis and offered solutions. They didn't just say, here's a problem, you fix it. They said, here's a problem and here are some solutions.
Yeah. On that point, and I find it, I'm being constructive here, believe me, and I think you know me well enough to know that I'm impartial in these matters.
Sure.
Opposition is at its best, whether we're talking about the economy, housing, health, whatever it might be, where you guys and gals not only say that's wrong or that's a mess, but then in the same breath say, and here is precisely how you could do it better. And if that's a compelling argument, a sensible minister will grab it and run with it.
Yep. And I'm saying to the government that at the very least, they could introduce emergency legislation, which we have thoughtfully prepared earlier, to temporarily suspend Section 21 and Section 8 grounds, 8 evictions, technical terms, but that would give courts back discretion in cases where someone has lost their income due to coronavirus and has struggled with rent. It would give the courts the ability to judge. Now, that would be a good thing. And the government has even said they're going to do this in the fullness of time with their renters reforms bill. Now, if they can't bring forward the entire bill, I'd rather they did, but if they can't, they could bring forward the emergency legislation. It's 2 pages of legislation. We could get it done in the first couple of weeks of September. All I'm asking them to do is to extend the ban until they've got a proper plan in place.
So again, and on a technical point there would be time, if Genrick accepts your argument, there would be time between Parliament coming back, even if it's virtual and Zooming and all that stuff, and this ban on evictions being lifted. There's time to change the rules of engagement.
No, I mean, the government has to decide now that they're going to extend the ban after.
All right, okay, so extend the ban, change the law when Parliament comes back, and then boof, off you go.
But, that short bits of legislation, we have shown over the last 6 months how short legislation and even sometimes quite long and complicated legislation can go through parliamentary processes when it needs to. Now, the government controls the parliamentary timetable. This is up to them. They've been told, they've been warned. They promised, Robert Jenrick promised that no one would lose their home because of coronavirus. He said that back in March. I just want to help him to keep to that promise for the sake of people renting their home.
Good to see you, Thangam.
You too.
Thanks for your time. That's Thangam Debbonaire, Labour's shadow housing minister.